Hello everybody, my name is Jackie Buie and I'm one of the pastors here at Gold Hill, and it's my pleasure to welcome you as you watch with us online today. Whether you're watching this morning on the Sunday or later on in the week, you're welcome. Now this is the second in our series of the Advent series called Together at Christmas. Advent is a time when we generally would be, with Christians, looking forward, that sense of anticipation, looking forward to Christmas and what it's all about for us. And you may be somebody who has an Advent calendar or an Advent candle, and those are things that symbolically help you to be forward-thinking, enjoying the opening of the little tags or lighting the candle each day. These are ways that we have kind of learnt how to enjoy that anticipation. It's a time of hope based on a reality. And here in this particular time of life, we are in a time of a pandemic. And the reality is that the hope we might have to be with people together, with family at Christmas time, is perhaps one that actually is not going to actually happen as we really would wish it to. I saw a post just this week by a friend on the internet, and they had written, "Now we finally will get to know who our parents' favourite child is." And that made me chuckle, because just the idea that actually parents potentially might have a favourite child, and it's going to be shown now because they're going to be the ones who are going to be invited to the Christmas festivities in people's homes. But it also can highlight the fact that actually some people are not going to be invited to be able to be with family, or they choose not to be, because this is not a time when actually people feel safe to gather with others in the home like we would normally do. But that can mean that people feel hugely left out or hurting or disappointed. And even if they understand the logistics in their head, it still can be really hard this year, because we're going forward wanting to be anticipating something really good, and yet actually our experience right now is this isn't quite the way we want it to be. So how can we find hope, real hope, within the situation we're in? As I said, last week Dave started looking at the story in the Bible where the angel Gabriel came to meet with Mary and dropped on her some news that really would have been shattering to her. She was a young woman, engaged to be married, and now this angel is telling her, life's not going according to your plan. You're going to become a mother. You're going to carry a baby, but not formed by normal human interaction with a man, but you will have the Holy Spirit come on you and a baby will grow in you. I find her calmness, seemingly from what we read in the scriptures, remarkable. So often people, when they get shocking news, go into almost like a freeze mode. I don't know if that's something you've experienced, perhaps when you might go to see a doctor and you know something is potentially going to be said to you, and you're sitting there, your heart is beating, and they start to tell you what they're going to say. And all of a sudden it's like the rest of the world just stops. Your brain goes into freeze mode. But Mary doesn't seem to have been like that. She seems to have been able to take on board what Gabriel has said to her and actually believe what in many ways is seemingly unbelievable. And they had such enormous consequences for her, as obviously we go on to know. But we also know from that interaction with Gabriel with Mary that Gabriel told us something about one of her relatives, an older lady in her family, who also, Gabriel told her, Elizabeth, this older relative, was going to have a baby, and this was her 6th month of pregnancy. This seemingly was not something Mary knew about. So here was another impossible thing for her to take on board. This old relative, too old to have a baby, now is carrying a baby. That's wow. I think as we read the scriptures sometimes we can forget this was wow factor. If you put yourself in Mary's shoes, can you imagine? I don't know. What would I have responded like? What would that have been like? Would I have believed as Mary did? Well, she seems to, and she seems to respond in this remarkable way, picking up. And so we're going to pick up the story now in Luke 1, verse 39. A few days later, Mary hurried to the hill country of Judea, to the town where Zechariah lived. She entered the house and greeted Elizabeth. At the sound of Mary's greeting, Elizabeth's child leapt within her, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. Elizabeth gave a glad cry and exclaimed to Mary, "God has blessed you above all women, and your child is blessed. Why am I so honoured that the mother of my Lord should visit me? When I heard your greeting, the baby in my womb jumped for joy. You are blessed because you believed that the Lord would do what he said." So what do I pick up from these verses? I see a human response happening almost immediately. The angel has now left her, and Mary then is left alone with all that she's just been told. Remarkable, remarkable stuff. And what does she do? Does she go to bed that night and think, who can I tell? Who can I talk to about this incredible news this angel has just spoken to me? I wonder, did she go to her mum or think about going to her mum, or maybe she's got sisters or maybe some friends. But can you imagine that actually that would be like thinking, well, you're going to tell them something, they're going to think, oh, Mary's going a bit mad. Is this the pressure of an impending wedding? What's going on with her? But what we see that she does is that she decides to go to a person who she has been told by Gabriel is also involved in this whole scenario. Elizabeth, this older woman. We don't know exactly what relative she was to her, but she was somebody who Mary obviously knew. And what we read in the scriptures is that she went on this journey from Galilee to the hill country of Judea. Now, the hill country of Judea is around Jerusalem. So if we look at the geography of that, that's a journey of about 80 to 100 miles. And she, we are told, hurried there. And that word hurried actually has kind of within it an understanding of being really enthusiastic and eager. And so she's got this huge journey to go on, which potentially would have taken about 3 days, potentially would have gone with what they would have called a caravan of people. We don't know all the details. How did she organize this? How did she do it? But all we know is that she was determined. She was a young woman now, endowed with this knowledge, and she was determined to get to see Elizabeth. So off she goes. And she arrives at Elizabeth's house, and we're told that she greets her. Now, here I have some of my little nativity figures. I thought, well, we need to continue really with what Dave did with us last week. So this is Mary, and here she is looking actually quite prayerful, somewhat bowed knee. And here I have adapted one of the figures, and this is Elizabeth. And we read that Mary comes to Elizabeth's house and greets her. Now, it's actually quite appropriate that probably Mary is slightly lower, because in the custom of those days, it's quite likely she would have greeted her by bowing, recognition that she was younger and this Elizabeth was older. And we hear that they greeted. That's all we know. But as they greeted, something extraordinary happens within Elizabeth. Elizabeth's baby, 6 months old, leaps. Not just that sort of little kick that I have enjoyed over the last year. For some of you would know that I've become a grandmother, and I've loved feeling my daughter's abdomen as I felt tiny kicks, and it's lovely. But this was something completely different to that. There was a leap that Elizabeth recognized was something extraordinary. And it was at that moment that something, I believe, deeply spiritual was going on. Elizabeth feels this, and it's at that moment, it's like the Spirit of God comes upon her and makes her speak these words of affirmation and exaltation and joy. And she says to Mary, God has blessed you above all women, and your child is blessed. The reality here is these two women's lives have been impacted humanly massively. But actually it's much bigger than that. Here is a reality of the Spirit of God resting on an older woman, proclaiming a prophetic word over Mary that actually has huge consequences. I asked at the beginning as I spoke today, what is it that actually can give us a real hope in this time of pandemic? It's not just about the joy of Christmas trees or dressing up in a red frock for Christmas and enjoying the things we might normally do, because those things come and go as we're seeing in this time of a pandemic. But actually, the hope of God investing his own Son into the life of a tiny baby in Mary. And at this point, that tiny baby was probably no bigger than a pip. And then the meeting together as the greeting happened between Mary and Elizabeth, the Spirit of God was powerfully there. And that is when Elizabeth proclaims this message over Mary. And I think it must have been so encouraging for Mary, because although she knows she's met Gabriel and she's heard the message, here is God's beautiful affirmation to her again of, you are indeed carrying a child. Because there was no way for her to know it. She wouldn't have been able to feel anything yet. The humanity of this is still happening, but now Elizabeth has proclaimed this over her because the baby inside her, John, leapt. So it was like the Spirit touched him as Mary spoke. All of this, if we think about it humanly, is just beautifully remarkable. Remarkable for this older woman, actually. If we just step slightly back in time, this woman has for decades, presumably, been married to Zechariah, and they wouldn't have been able to have a baby, it seems. And that for a woman of her generation and in that society would have been a huge burden of sorrow. Society then very much focusing around family and having children, and she wasn't able to. So I wonder what her life had been like up until this point, married with no child, that possibly deep lingering sadness. Even though her husband was of a high level, he was a priest, a Levite, still within her as a woman, I imagine, that deep sense of being barren. And now, though, she's expecting. But the process by which she found out she was expecting is also just a beautiful story. So Zechariah, we know, was in the temple, and he was met by an angelic being who told him, you and your wife are going to have a child. And basically, we see him, even though a Levite, even though he would have been knowledgeable of the ways God had worked through his people, he didn't believe this message. And so he was struck mute. So I just kind of imagine this mute man coming back to his wife, in some ways indicating to her, you and I are going to have a baby. And we don't know what went on there, but they came together as a man and a woman and had sex, and they had having a baby. That in itself was a miracle, a different sort of miracle to the one that we see with Mary, but no less powerful to actually recognize that God can break in to people's situations that seem impossible. Because if God says things are possible, they are. And that was what Mary was told by Elizabeth, that because you have believed, you are blessed. It's hard, isn't it, to believe things when all the circumstances around us tell us something different. For us in a pandemic, it seems like it's going on and on. But actually, if God chooses to break in again in some way, well, we need to be ready for that. Recently, in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, one of our mission partners had left his area where he's living, and he'd gone a couple of days' journey to pick up a huge container that he knew was out there in the bush, and they needed to get it back to where he lives. They got to this place, they found the container, it was completely overgrown with the equivalent of brambles, and they also found there were these huge bee nests in it. So what did he do? He contacted his prayer group back here in the UK and I think across different parts of the world, and he said to us, please will you pray that these bees choose to leave. Now, we're praying then for something that is not humanly very normal or typical. And these bees had been ferocious in the district that they were, and the people around was saying to them, you don't want to touch these bees because they are big stingers. In fact, they had killed some cattle because they'd stung them. Anyway, the mission partner said, please pray. So a number of us prayed. And then they went and actually tried to remove them. And what happened was actually remarkable according to the local people, not just according to the mission partner, because they managed over a period to get rid of those bee nests. And they had a few stings. It wasn't like they came out completely unscathed, but nothing at all like the locals were expecting. Now, what do you do when you hear a story like that? Do you put around it circumstances and go, well, that was probably due to X, Y, Z? Or do you believe, no, God heard the prayers of people and chose to answer? I believe the latter. I believe God intervenes. He hears our prayers, and he'd heard Elizabeth's cry for decades that she would have a baby. And now, although she thought all was lost, it wasn't. And she was now carrying this 6-month-old. So when we see God potentially intervene, can we believe it? And I see within Elizabeth that now, because she has experienced one miracle, I perceive that she was now more open to be able to allow the Spirit of God to use her to be this prophet in this situation. I don't know if those words just literally bubbled up without her having any control or not, but she spoke these beautiful, liberating, truthful words over Mary in a way that I just think was partly because now she had a bigger view of God than she did have before. Remembering, Mary didn't show any sign of pregnancy. Mary hadn't told her. She just knew because the Spirit of God told her. And God still speaks today to you and I believe, if we let him. But for Mary, this was huge, wonderful confirmation that potentially liberated her. And we know she then stayed with Elizabeth for a number of months. She was told, you are blessed because you have believed what the Lord said would happen. God is always on the lookout for people who are willing to believe the unbelievable. Now, the story of Christmas for some people seems nothing more than similar to a Santa Claus or fairy tale, because it just seems like there's too much in there that goes against the grain. It goes against nature. People throughout history have looked at the Christmas story and just thought, nah, that's not possible. Science tells us, nature tells us that babies only happen when a man and a woman come together. And to be fair, that was how I believe God made for reproduction to happen. But just because God has set things in motion that way does not mean that we then can't expect that he will do things differently when he chooses. I can fully understand why people question it. And even people who are Christians like myself at times may question and have doubts, but doubts are not bad. It's okay to doubt, but it's what we do with those doubts, I think, that really counts. Do we take our doubts and question them? Maybe if you're a believer, do you question with God? Or do you end up becoming hard and cynical? Zechariah, we heard, doubted, but God still used him. It wasn't the end of the road, so it's okay if you have doubts. So we've got Mary encouraged by Elizabeth's words, wonderful confirmation of what the angel had said just a few days before. I want to just draw 3 different things from this passage this morning, briefly, and I wonder which of these may be things that impact you. Firstly, I'd suggest, can we consider, you and me, where do we have doubts? And what are we going to do with them? If you're somebody watching today and you've never really believed this Christian message, you think it sounds nice, you think it looks good for other people, but actually you don't really believe it. What are you going to do with that? Are you just going to push it to one side and not do anymore? Or are you actually potentially going to investigate further? I'd encourage you to do the latter. Many people have started from a point of disbelief. Even somebody like C.S. Lewis did. And yet he then came through that to a total belief that Jesus was in fact God's Son, and that the unbelievable was actually credible. If you're a believer and you have doubts, do not fear those doubts, but bring them to God. And be honest with him. He knows it anyway, of course. But he would like you to talk these things over with him. And of course, you can talk with friends, other believers, and ask, what do you do with this? How do you deal with that question? It's all right to doubt. So one of the things I see here is the potential through this passage to see why things seem unbelievable, but just ask God, can I believe differently? Secondly, I see here a reality that I believe God would want to happen within his church, is that just like Elizabeth was a bit like a mentor to Mary, Mary went to her at her point of need, an older woman, somebody she knew, somebody she trusted, the wife of a priest, a Levite, somebody she trusted, and she took herself there and she found solace and a person she could really live life with alongside. The whole thing of mentoring in our society can sound a bit sort of almost academic or set up, but I really see within the scriptures that we have a number of people who we saw mentored others. Paul, one of the people in the New Testament, mentored Timothy, a younger person in the faith. In the Old Testament, we have Elijah, who mentored Elisha. There's a number of these sort of older people mentoring younger. I'm wondering, as I was preparing this, and I saw within these scriptures that that's what really Elizabeth was doing. She was encouraging Mary. She was just living life alongside her. We don't know what conversations they had. I wonder if you yearn to have somebody older in your life, somebody not necessarily older in age, although often they go hand in hand, but somebody who's a bit further on in their faith. Elizabeth was only 6 months further on in having had a meeting with God and having a baby. And Mary was just behind her. But sometimes it's those who are not that much further ahead than us that actually really can understand us. Over just a week ago, I reconnected with a lady who is my spiritual director from 7 years ago, and I haven't really had any contact. And I just decided that actually at this point in my life, it would be good to get back in contact with her. And so I spent an hour with her over Zoom last week. She currently lives in Rome. And it's just a lovely, liberating thing to be able to talk life through with somebody, talk about faith, talk about my journey, and have somebody speak into that trusting person to me. But I also really enjoy walking alongside those who are asking for me to be a bit of a mentor to them. So what about you? Are you somebody actually who would love to do that, or somebody you'd like to have a mentor type person? Then ask God who that person should be. This might be a great time to do that. Why not consider who that can be? And that leads me to just the final point. In this small part of the Bible, we have seen how the Spirit of God came upon Elizabeth and spoke prophetically. Now you might think, well, I'm nothing like Elizabeth. But we are all going to have opportunity over this Christmas period, whether or not you're sitting around a table with just a few of your family, or maybe you're having a neighbour, or whoever it is you're bubbling with, as we use this language now. Whoever you're with, I wonder if God would want to be using you as some voice of hope to whoever it is you're sitting around the table with. I would suggest ask God to lead you, to enable you to be bold, to consider how big he is, how much your own life has been changed by him, so that you feel like you've got a bit of a story to tell. Maybe you even want to prepare something if you know that you're going to be sitting around the table at Christmas with some people. Why not think about that and ask God to guide you? Whichever perhaps of those three options might be appropriate for you. I would just encourage us to see that within this scripture that we've looked at, we see the remarkable bigness of God breaking in to what would have seemed impossible for Mary and for Elizabeth, and actually begin to build a greater hope that over this coming Christmas, God is going to use you, turn your life around even more. So I really hope that in this Christmas time, the reality of Advent, the hope that we're looking forward to, can grow in your heart.